Hello everyone, welcome to the Age Group Triathlon podcast. In this week's episode, I'm going to be looking at how much we as age groupers can learn from professional athletes. Because I think a lot of, age group athletes, they fall into the trap almost of, hanging on every word of a professional athlete to really, hold what they do in the highest of esteems and thinking, right, okay, I really need to replicate what it is that they're doing in my own training. And you know what? You can totally understand how this would happen. Now, I have enormous amount of respect for professional triathletes and elite triathletes. If you look at, anyone who can, knock out an Olympic distance in under 2 hours or can do an Ironman in sort of at the 8 hour mark, look, I'm going to listen to what it is that they have to say. However, a lot of them, they live in a sort of a very different world from us, almost at points. I'm going to have a look at some of the differences and some of the reasons why, you might want to think a little bit more critically about, some of the advice that you hear and read from professional triathletes going forward. Now, I'm just going to clear up a couple of things first. Firstly is that, again, I'm lucky enough to, I wouldn't call myself a friend, more sort of an associate of, some professional triathletes. I've got enormous amount of respect for what it is that they're doing. And at no point am I calling them out on their privilege or, their lifestyle, anything like that. I'm merely drawing attention to the differences between, what they're doing and what we're doing and how they may not necessarily sort of understand quite the, what it is that the things that we go through as age groupers. I'm not saying that either of us has it harder or easier. I'm not suggesting that. Just that it is different, okay? And that, we are living life in, obviously in parallel, training for the same sport, but it really is very different the way that we approach it. And the next thing is sort of clarifying the difference, almost as it were, between a professional triathlete and an elite triathlete. Now, again, this, you could be called splitting hairs here a little bit, but an elite triathlete is a term that is used broadly for a athlete who is on some national governing body funding. So it could be that they have been picked up as a prospect by the British Triathlon Talent Scouting Team. It could be that they have been sort of they've come to it a little bit later in life, whatever the reason is. They'll generally race over shorter distances. So the sprint and the Olympic and the mixed relay and the events that, generally speaking, sort of elite triathletes will compete in. However, the term elite could also just be used to explain somebody who regularly podiums or wins events as an age group, okay? It's not something that has really a strict definition. Whereas a professional triathlete, at least in my eyes, tradition refers to an athlete who is racing sort of longer to middle distance events, would have more in the way of commercial partnerships and prize money, sponsorships, all of that, and they will sort of almost be running their own business as an athlete, where your elite triathlete could be on, say, using British Triathlon as an example, they could be on funding and they could get 30 grand a year from British Triathlon to live off and to support their training. They wouldn't normally have the same amount of sponsorships, but again, it really depends on how successful an athlete is. And something else to draw attention to is that I know that I am, when I talk about pros here, realistically, I'm going to be referring to those who are sort of within the top 10% of the pro field, okay? I'm talking about your Cat Matthews, I'm talking about your Joe Skipper, I'm talking about your Alistair and Jonathan Brownlee, your Jan Frodeno, your Daniela Reeves, your Lucy Charles Barclays, these names that are people who often get interviewed, they have their own, maybe sort of coaching companies, and they really are sort of advertised as being authorities on the sport, which, let's face it, they are. But there are a lot of professional athletes out there who aren't actually that dissimilar from you and I. A professional triathlete can simply be somebody who placed very well at a sort of a national championship. You can get your pro card. And some people race as a professional athlete whilst working a full-time job. Now, if you were to look at your average sort of Ironman race and look at the field, chances are, for most events, excluding kind of World Championship events or maybe those that are as part of the Ironman Pro Series, if you look at your average pro race, you probably wouldn't recognise a good sort of 2/3 of the names, maybe 3/4 of the names, because a lot of people they drop in and out of the pro field. They could have this absolutely breakthrough year, have fantastic performance, get their pro card over sort of the middle distance, and they race in the pro field for a couple of years. Because of the benefits you get as a professional athlete, having a different start, priority bike racking, all of this, and there may not be, operating on a completely and totally different level, in the same way that we would be towards like the Christian Blumfelds of the world. But they are out there, and I guess the sort of the downside of this, especially for sort of the female pros, is that the way that an Ironman race will work is the pro men will go off and there'll be about 5 minutes or so, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and then the pro women will go off. And then there's normally sort of a 10, 15, 20 minute wait before the age group athletes start. But due to only getting, a relatively small head start on the field, a lot of the sort of the slower pro women will get caught by the real fast top end age groupers. And nobody's doing anything wrong here. It's not a case that the pro women are too slow to be pros, because well, they're not. They're racing in the professional field. It's not that the male athletes are too strong and they should give the women's race space, or because we're all racing on the same course. But if you are one of these very strong age group men who does catch up to the women's race, you just need to be sure to be respectful, to give them space, not to sit there and to sort of sit on their wheels or to block them or anything like that. Just try to really keep your distance and respect the fact that they're in a completely different race to you. And a lot of professional athletes aren't actually full-time athletes either. I've said that some of them will have full-time jobs, but even a lot of perfectly good professional triathletes actually have part-time jobs that they keep on sort of the sly, just to help make ends meet, to help them pay the rent or pay the mortgage, because it really is quite brutal out there as a professional athlete. Now, if you're a big name, you can get really lucrative sponsorship deals, and you can live a life of almost luxury as a professional triathlete. If you are winning major races, if you're podium at world championships, if you're regularly winning Ironman branded events, okay, these are absolutely enormous. They're phenomenal. You can earn a lot of money, but very few athletes are ever going to race at that level. Pro athletes, that is, and a lot of them, they do need something to subsidise their racing. Unless somebody has really wealthy family or connections, when you consider all of the costs involved with triathlon, and the actual prize purse at events isn't actually that sort of groundbreaking in most cases. You do find yourself caught in this sort of trap almost. Now, you can look at the Ironman Pro Series, you can look at the T100 and go, oh yeah, but they can earn this much for winning events. But you often need an invite to even get to attend these events. And so, as much as I like what they're doing, you can end up with sort of this two-tier sort of society between your professional athletes who are full-time athletes who are racing at the highest of levels, earning all this money, and those that are just trying to break through, but due to the other commitments that they have going on in their life, they just can't train or commit as much as those who are in a sort of a more privileged position, should we say. So yeah, it can be really difficult. The pro athletes who are juggling full-time work, I think we can all learn a lot more from as age groupers than those who are within sort of the top 10-20% of the sport. Now, the vast majority of professional athletes are going to be coming from a place of, competing, training an awful lot. Chances are since they were sort of 6, 7, 8 years old, something like that. And with that comes not only a huge amount of base fitness, a huge amount of durability and resilience, it also brings with it a fantastic sort of movement literacy, a body that is very supple, flexible, mobile, that can do all the things we're asking of it in training. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because some, professional triathletes, elite triathletes, won't really do anything much in the way of strength and conditioning. And you will find age groupers who are reluctant to to do any strength work, and they will, in the name of confirmation bias, they will find an athlete out there, a professional athlete who doesn't do any strength work, and they go, aha, yes, but this guy went to the Olympics and he doesn't do any strength work, so I don't have to. And if you are a office worker in their mid-40s who spends the vast majority of their day sat down, you are going to be in a very, very different place to somebody who's in their early 20s and can get away with an awful lot more. Somebody who spends most of their time sat down, they're going to have weak glutes, they're going to have tight hips, they're probably going to have weak, tight hamstrings as well. They may have postural issues from being sat at a desk. Okay, there can be a real variety of issues that we need to use strength and conditioning to approach really. If we're going to be running at the kind of intensity and the kind of volume that we want to be training for our events, okay, we can't afford to just keep pounding our body without doing any kind of preventative work. Yes, if we do just a little bit of stretching or a little bit of planking, that's not going to have an enormous impact on our training and our racing. But if we have a really good plan in place that will allow us to be able to train at the kind of volume and the kind of intensity that we want to, we are, as older athletes, we are going to have to include that. And actually nowadays it's very rare that pros include zero strength and conditioning. I think that even a lot of very reluctant coaches have come around to it and started to understand and appreciate the benefits of it. I think that there's kind of especially in swimming, sort of a mindset of push all of your athletes really, really hard. And then the ones that are left over, the ones that don't drop out, don't get injured, don't burn out, those are going to be your champions. And I take a real issue with this. I think that's a very unhealthy way to coach people, but it's what people do. There's no getting around that. And a lot of those that are professional athletes, they may just be sort of more naturally resilient to injury than their counterparts. But again, it is quite rare these days that somebody has absolutely zero strength and conditioning, because as much as from an injury prevention, they are also just sort of giving up performance, and we're slowly moving away from the training methods of kind of the 80s and 90s when the sport was very young. And we're sort of fumbling around trying to find, how can we be faster? Well, let's look at how cyclists train and how swimmers train and how runners train, and we'll just kind of mash it all together. We are now getting a bit more scientific and having a more holistic view of training. Another major difference is the volume that pro triathletes will train at. The intensity isn't actually necessarily all that different. If we're looking for somebody to do 5 by 3 minute VO2 intervals, the difference between our sessions is that, our FTP might be 200 watts and their FTP might be 375 watts, So the sessions are not similar, but the principles are the same. And the distribution of intensity probably shouldn't be miles apart. Now, it does depend on the athlete, it depends on what they respond to. But it's not like, professional triathletes are going to be doing a bunch more intensity, or amateur athletes would be doing a bunch more intensity from like an ideal, scientifically supported background. That is, I know there are a lot of age groupers, amateur triathletes who will just do intensity all day long. And these are the ones that sort of tend to get injured, but just because you can, doesn't mean you should. But the fact is that most age group athletes will be training somewhere between like the 8 and maybe sort of 15. I think is 8 and 15 is normally somewhere around about average. Of course, you do get some that train for 20, 25 hours. Those who have a living situation that allows them to dedicate that much time to their training. But there is no way that we are going to be able to replicate the same results that a professional triathlete is getting from doing a third, a half of their volume. Okay? It's just not going to happen. And we need to accept that and go, look, we can read 220 Triathlon magazine, and we can check out, oh look, this is Tim Don's favourite run workout, but we're never going to be able to run like Tim Don because we're not putting in, we haven't got sort of 30 years of running behind us, and we're not putting in that same level of volume that he is. So again, I'm not saying don't follow the workouts of the pros like in isolation, but we do have to accept that whilst they could make us, faster, that it's not like if we keep following these that we are going to start training and racing like these exceptional athletes who are at the end of the day just fantastic genetic specimens. Another major difference is the kit and the sort of the budget, the sponsorships that a professional triathlete will have. Now, I have to say, I really do take issue with some professional triathletes who sort of have podcasts, or they answer questions from the public, and they'll say, oh, you've got to get SRAM red, because it's so much better having those blips. They just change it so much, you just got to do it. And I don't think they could even tell you how much SRAM red costs. Hint, it's a lot. And, people ask, oh, do I need to get a disc wheel, or is a deep section wheel fine? They go, oh, you've got to get a disc wheel, like it's always faster. Just, I've never regretted having a disc wheel, just do it. But, I mean, do most of the listeners have $2,500 to drop on a disc wheel? I think a lot of these sort of really top pros, I mean, they probably can't remember the last time that they paid for any equipment. They're just used to getting free drops in from their sponsors. Oh yes, I make sure that I use my Morton gels during every session. Okay, but how much is that going to cost an athlete? Who has to buy all of their nutrition themselves. And there can be sort of a real disconnect. They almost sometimes feel that they're living in another world, where they are just like they don't have an appreciation for the amount that things cost and the money that most people have to invest. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of age group triathletes probably have more to invest than a lot of the pros that are lower down the rankings. And you know what? It's just the way it is. If an age group triathlete is working as a banker or as a stock trader or anything like that, yeah, they're going to be earning a lot more money than your average professional triathlete. Maybe, not as much as your very top professional triathlete, but they will have the money to splash, to drop 12 grand on that new Canyon as soon as it comes out. That is the target audience of these, really high-end bikes, and it is who the sponsors are trying to earn the ear of. They sponsor a professional triathlete A, and and you have all these bankers that will listen to professional triathlete A's podcast, and they bang on about how great this piece of kit is. Then when it comes out, they just go straight there and buy it. They don't even look at the price tag. They just wave their Amex at the cashier. Yep, great, I've got it. This is going to make me faster. And you do end up with not only, some pros being completely disassociated from the costs associated, but sort of sponsorships. It really is an absolute minefield. Now, as a coach, I've had some brands approach me, email me, wondering whether, they can sponsor me, my business, what it is that I do. I've always said no. Some people, why would you do that? Why would you ever turn that away? Oh, okay, so they promise me, "Oh, we'll send you some wetsuits, and we'll give you a discount off of everything else in the store, and a discount for your athletes." But the downside to this, in my eyes at least, is that if we take wetsuit brand X, now that brand, it may work really well for me, and I may love the product. And I would be, I guess, I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with recommending it to people. What I don't want to be doing is I don't want to be telling everyone on this podcast, all of my clients, paid clients, "Oh, you know what, you need to use wetsuit brand X because they're the best, and here's a discount code." Because you could then have people go, "Oh yeah, that's great. I've got this discount code. I can get sort of 20% off these wetsuits. I'll go and I'll get them." But then if the wetsuit doesn't fit, if it just doesn't suit their body type, if they're between sizes, it's a bit baggy, the neckline isn't right for them, whatever the reason, then they will sort of find themselves sort of training and racing in a wetsuit that's actually going to inhibit their development. And I've always, I guess, sort of been a bit uncomfortable with that, really. I'd always just want to make sure that an athlete is always making the right decision for them, that they go into any kind of purchasing situation in a shop, online, looking to find what is the best product for me. Rather than, "Oh, well, my coach tells me that, Simon, with his podcast, he's always talking about these wetsuits or this nutrition." Because so much of it is personal, and I want to make sure that everybody, achieves their potential, and they're not being held back by me recommending them a piece of equipment that may or may not work well for them. It could be that 2/3 of people get on really well with wetsuit brand X. But for the kind of the other third who really don't get on with it, they've just sort of spent money on a wetsuit that was never going to suit them. And yeah, it is going to affect their enjoyment of the sport as well as their results. Now, I am in a place of privilege here in that my income is from coached athletes, and that I don't need sponsor income to be able to facilitate what it is that I do. Which makes it all, which is just another reason why I'm not going to sort of potentially sabotage the racing and training of other clients for the sake of somebody sending me a free wetsuit, So, but professional triathletes, they're not that lucky. They do have to work with sponsors just to help sort of keep a roof over their heads. And if you are a professional athlete, and you send out a bunch of emails, you approach various different bike brands, you're looking for a bike sponsor, and the only brand that gets back to you, pulling a name out of the air here, Giant, the only brand that gets back to you is Giant, and they go, "Okay, let's have a phone call, let's have a Zoom meeting, let's discuss this, or come and meet us, have a chat with us at a head office." And they go through, and they're the only option that they have. And they try the bikes, and they're fine, they get on with them. But part of that sponsorship deal is going to be, well, you need to make sure that you post about us 3 times a week on Instagram and tag us. Okay? It's not necessarily an unreasonable ask, especially if they are giving you sort of one of their absolute top end time trial bikes. And might end up, again, there's often prize money that comes with professional triathletes, podium, especially at large events. They are investing in you, they're taking a chance on you, and they need to see that you're going to return that. But sometimes you'll have professional athletes who they might be, those who aren't at the very top of the sport. They may end up working with nutrition brand Y. And they just don't really get on with their products. They much prefer nutrition brand Z. But they have to tell everyone that nutrition brand Y is the best. Y is the one that is going to work for them. Because they're, it's their job to. And you even get, in some situations, I believe, some professional athletes who will be pushing devices and equipment they don't even use in their own training. But they've been approached by a brand, they've been offered a big payday to be able to promote this, and so they do. They make a few Instagram reels about it, they do some interviews, they come onto a podcast, they're preaching about it. They might not even use it in their own training. So sort of the take-home message from this really is, just to use your brain. If a professional triathlete recommends a piece of equipment, I'm not saying you should, disregard that. You shouldn't pay attention. It could be worth, you considering it. But because a lot of professional triathletes have the likes of Lionel Sanders, they have these huge social media followings. And, I think it's great what they're doing. They are sharing the ins and outs of it, in a very candid way of their training, how it all works. And they have this captive audience that a lot of sponsors love and want to cash in on. So just make sure that you are looking at alternatives, reading reviews, trying to find out a bit more before you just hit the buy now button because your favourite professional triathlete has recommended it. Something else I wanted to touch on is the stacking of workouts. So if you are a professional triathlete, you're going to be training 2, maybe 3 times a day. Possibly even 4 if you include a mobility or strength session in there. Okay, they are doing a huge amount of training. And some pros, they'll go, okay, well, like Tuesday will be my intensity day, and they could have a hard run in the morning and a hard bike in the afternoon. Sorry if you can hear the sounds of the children playing out there. It is the school holidays, and I'm not going to be Ebenezer Scrooge and shout out my window to keep it down. But they may have, Tuesday is going to be one of my harder days. I know that the Brownlee brothers used to have intervals on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and everything else was easy. So they may say, okay, so Tuesday is going to be my intensity day, and I'll have 2 hard sessions in that day. Now, because they are a professional athlete, their ability to recover between sessions is going to be high because their body is that well trained. And equally, they could get up, they could do a hard swim at 6 a.m, be finished by 7, half 7, go home, eat well, put their feet up, get on with other bits during the day. And then when it gets to 4 p.m, 5 p.m, they might go out and do a hard run. And their body is well conditioned to that because they've been doing it for years. And they have figured for themselves that they respond really well if they do those 2 hard sessions back to back on the same day rather than do them one day after another. However, I think there are very few age group triathletes who have that base fitness and that ability to do 2 hard sessions in one day. I think for the most part is unnecessary, and that there are much better ways for you to be able to spread it out. Most age group athletes probably shouldn't be doing much more than 2, maybe 3 hard sessions a week. And doing 2 in one day, it does just feel the quality of that session is going to be compromised. Which brings me on to the subject of professional triathletes as coaches. And there will be a number of professional triathletes out there, or ex-pros, who are coaches. And I would wager a guess that they're probably going to be better coaches than me for the most part, simply due to their breadth of knowledge, and their experience in the sport. However, whilst they would be much better than I would be at, really being able to analyse somebody's swim stroke, or be able to give the perfect plan for absolute peak performance in some cases, I do believe that for your average age grouper, if you aren't looking to qualify for Kona, if you're not looking to win an Ironman event, I think that your average age group will probably be able to relate an awful lot better to me than somebody who's been at the very top of the sport. And again, this isn't to hate on the professional triathlete, because what they're doing is they're simply relaying all of their knowledge and how they gain their knowledge, which is from working, with some of the best coaches, sports scientists, training partners over the years. But the key part about working with an ex-pro, or even, a coach who prides themselves, a non-pro coach, but somebody who's a very elite coach who may have won their age group in Kona, for instance, is that they tend to go into coaching relationships with a bit more of, they've already decided what the training plan is going to look like, because it is what they did, Now, this isn't always the case, but it is for the majority of cases, from what I understand, is that those who are incredibly successful athletes think that everybody should train like them, because that's how they got their results. And as coaches, we all have our different methods. We all have, our different approaches to training. But I think that those who are or were professional triathletes, they might, emphasis on might, just want to real sort of railroad you towards their way of training, rather than actually listening to the athlete and going, okay, so it seems you respond really well to that. Okay, well, let's make sure that we include some of that then. Whereas some might go, oh no, that doesn't work. That's not the best way to get results. We're going to do this instead. And a lot of, if somebody were to do this, then a lot of athletes would sort of trust them. Go, well, this person's won 5 professional Ironman races. Of course, I'm going to listen to them. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get the best results. And some of those sort of coaches, they can be quite sort of autocratic. I'm going to tell you exactly what you're going to do and you're going to like it. And if you don't get the results that you want, that's your fault. Some people respond really well to that kind of coaching. I mean, to me, it's just not in my wheelhouse. That's not interesting to me. But so I do think it can be a bit of a double-edged sword working with an ex-professional as a coach, because on the one hand, you have access to all this experience, all this knowledge, all of all the things that they can share with you from their time racing, all these insights that I maybe wouldn't be able to offer myself. But on the other hand, they just may not quite understand what it's like to have children, to be tired from working overtime. I'm sorry I couldn't do the evening session. I ended up being in the office for 14 hours because we had a crisis. Yeah, but you're not committed. I expect the commitment from my athletes. You should have done it when you got home. And then, it can, from what I've heard from people who've discussed coaching relationships they've had like that, it can slide a little bit that way. So again, not telling you not to work with an ex-pro as a coach, just, things to consider, things to be aware of, and if you do have a chat with them about the potential of coaching, just to get an idea of how that's going to look and how much they'll sort of actually really listen to you. Something else we have to keep in mind is that professional triathletes, this is their job. And we really need to keep that at the forefront of our mind. Whenever we're comparing ourselves to the pros, the decisions that they make, all of this, is that for them, the difference between 4th and 3rd could be the difference between them losing their job or not, or their sponsorship deals. It really is of utmost importance to them for them to be able to, to achieve their goals. And they are going to make enormous sacrifices. They are going to train when age group triathletes maybe shouldn't, if they're unwell. They have less generally going on in their life than your average age group. And that's a very sweeping statement. But a lot of them, they're young, they're single, and they are solely focused on triathlon. Whereas you might be the parent of 2 children, you've got a full-time job, you've got a partner, you've got a house that you're looking after. All of these responsibilities that come to us, that at the end of the day are more important than our result at this race. If you are a parent and your child is unwell and you're up half the night looking after them, then you need to adapt your training to reflect that. Okay, it could be that you take a rest day. It could be that you do something really easy. Whatever it is, the ability of you to keep your job, to keep a roof over your head, to keep food on your table and look after your family is far more important than any triathlon result will ever be. Whereas for the professionals, triathlon is how they keep a roof over their head and they put food on their table. They may not have the same commitments that you do, sort of socially and with family. Again, very sweeping statement. But triathletes, professional triathletes, are incredibly focused. They are, incredibly sort of single-minded because they have to be. If you look at professional cyclists, they can be riding down a mountain, get a corner wrong, go flying off their bike on a mountain descent, land in a ravine, and then climb back out, grab their bike and keep going. Because for them, it is their job to get on their bike and to ride to that finish. Obviously, if they needed very serious medical attention, obviously, their employer isn't going to think less of them for that. But when you are a professional athlete, your entire life revolves around your performance, and you have to make very different choices in your life relative to somebody who is a triathlete. Now, a lot of people will fall into triathlon because they find themselves a bit kind of adrift and without purpose in life. Their kids could have moved out. It could be a bit of a midlife crisis thing. It could be that they just have time and money on their hands and they don't know how to do it, what they can do to feel good about themselves, and they find triathlon. But it is really important to keep all of this in perspective at all times, and to not kind of beat yourself up for not taking it as seriously, not being as dedicated as these absolutely world-class athletes are, because that's just not sustainable for age group athletes. Now, I apologise if this has come off as something of a negative episode. It's not my intention. My intention is to draw your attention to the differences between age group triathletes and professional triathletes, so that you don't, follow all of their advice without engaging your brain and without thinking, is it realistic for me to be able to follow this advice, to try and copy this training schedule, considering how different their journey is to mine? To not blindly purchase any product that they're promoting, okay? And to just, make sure that you are putting yourself and your journey at the forefront of your mind, rather than what it is that you feel that you should be doing, what it is that other people are telling you should be doing. And that we are all on different journeys, and we need to cut ourselves slack, and we need to engage our brains before we just follow any information that comes our way. So, shorter episode this week, but there's only so many times that I can go over those relatively simple points. Thank you once again for joining me, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. See you all next Tuesday morning.